guys, I hope you are well. This week we're looking at Sadker and Zittleman Chapter 9, which focuses on financing and governing America's schools. We've looked a lot at school finance throughout the Kozel book because it's one of the inequities that he talks about. So you guys should do great on that part of the quiz. And the work that you're doing this week that's new is a little more about the governing of America's schools, which is important and will affect you all as teachers. This slide covers something that we discussed in the Kozel book, but we want to bring it back up, is just where public education money comes from, right? So where does the least come from looking at this? Right, the federal government. And where does the most come from? That's right, your state sources, followed up by your local sources, right? So in our Constitution, we have certain responsibilities given to the federal government, and then there's an amendment that says the rest of the things belong to the states. So that's why we have marriage stuff going out with the states, driver's licenses, all those are the state's job. Education is one of those things, right? Education is the state's job, and so any funding or legislation of what we should do with education legally rests with the states. The federal government part is usually just about their portion of the funding. Now, where does this money go? Most of it, right, goes towards instruction, as you'd expect. We have another large portion that goes to administration, operations, and then student support services for additional, counselor, guidance counselor, etc. Now, do you think this looks like what it should look like? Should we spend the money differently? There's not one right answer to that, but it's important to note that the majority goes to instruction. So in the Kozel book and in this chapter, you'll see discussion of inequalities in educational funding, right? Because over 40% comes from the local district, so that could be, $1,000 and $10,000 a student, so that could be widely different, and so you have schools that have widely different funding. Does that matter? Should we care about that, right? That's contentious. Some people think it doesn't, right? Some people think it does. The reason sometimes people think it doesn't, right, include, one, the Horatio-Alger myth. This is the idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, right? This is a myth or a story from the 1910s, 1920s about this rags to riches character, right? So the idea that, well, people have made it from nothing, so really you don't need well-funded schools to make it. Two, genetics, the idea that, well, some people's performance is just determined on genetics, so it doesn't matter how much money you put in the school. We also have a culture of local control, used to being able to decide what you want in your schools via your school board, right? And control usually comes with money, so you're not going to get too far away from local control, local funding, as long as you have local control, right? Money and decision making kind of go together. The idea of poverty, that if you have schools that are well funded, but you have kids without health care or dental care or food, that you're still going to have issues, so poverty is a wider issue in American society. We have a lot of kids who live in poverty compared to other countries, percentage-wise. So there's an idea that why bother, right, worrying about school inequities? It's not big enough to solve this problem. You've got studies, which our book calls flawed, that show that a lot of variations in student performance are based on these outside factors in student lives and not only on what happens inside the classroom. And then, as we saw in our Kozel book, there'll be new programs or something, and they're not enough to result in achievement gains. So that results in people saying the next time around, well, that program didn't make any difference, so why bother funding the next program, right? Kozel argues that it wasn't enough, right? The program wasn't enough, it wasn't long enough. But that's certainly a reason that you'll find folks not wanting to make school funding equitable. Okay, This is just a ranking of how much states spend on per pupil, so per student expenditures from about 10 years ago. Remember, states spend about half of the money that you see in public education. You'll notice New York and New Jersey at the top, Utah's at the bottom, right? So local districts would spend more in Utah. And then we see South Carolina somewhere in the middle. We're not super surprised, right? Especially because the cost of living in South Carolina, Georgia is lower than it would be in New Jersey, New York. However, I do want to point out Massachusetts, Connecticut, a lot of high achievers in U.S. public schools are closer to the top. All right. What about you? Do you think this is the right way to finance public schools? Well, if you think that we should use federal or state taxes, you would be in the majority. Um, Over time, more and more people think that these should be funded with state or federal taxes, right? There's a loss of interest in local control, um, as you can see, kind of moving from the right to the left, or, the closest column is people now, and then as you move further to the right, it's what people used to think. All right. Some of the reasons that funding is often needed, right, is to construct schools. And this slide just alludes to the chapter where it discusses the ways that environmental factors impact the condition of schools and the condition of student learning, right? So all of these things, noise control, indoor quality, heating, ventilation, all of these things are help people learn and help people work, right? Physical building security. If you can't see, if the lighting's not good, you're not going to be able to learn as much. If you have health issues from indoor air quality, it's going to affect your learning, right? So all these things would be important. I want to briefly allude to a study from the Housing Projects of Chicago, so this is not schools, but that showed a decrease in murder rate in the housing projects that had green space at the bottom, right? So more trees and more grass, fewer murders, right? So the idea of the environment affecting human behavior is very real. And so we see that in schools as well, right? So do students have a pleasant environment in which to learn? That often makes a difference regarding how much they learn. In your quiz, there are some questions about the responsibilities at different levels of the state school system. And so you want to just note you have certain kind of state responsibilities, State Board of Education, they license teachers, etc., and going down towards to the local boards of education and local superintendents, which influence a whole other set of issues, right? Some places they choose textbooks, they hire teachers, right, etc. Okay. So this just reviews again, right? So state governments levy taxes, they license teachers, set standards, they regulate the local school districts. But when we get down to the local school districts, they actually have to implement things. They hire the people, right? They decide how much they're going to pay the teachers, how long they're going to work, the hours, etc. In union states, this would be negotiated with the union, which is not the case in South Carolina or Georgia. And they create plans, etc. We talked a little bit about superintendents, right? They're the boss of the school system, but they're hired by the school board. They make a lot of money because they have a lot of responsibility. If something goes wrong in the schools, right, or things aren't going the right direction, they're going to be let go. But they're often hired to bring change to the system. And this is something usually people do after years of experience or being a principal, etc. Speaking of which, our next slide is about being a principal, and just that most elementary school principals are women, most secondary school principals are men, but it's about half and half overall. In all schools, you see 84% of principals being white. That's about the same amount of teachers. So it doesn't reflect the student population, but it's similar to the teacher population. If you want to be a principal, you would teach for a few years. You want to be a very good teacher, and you earn a credential, right, or a master's degree in school leadership. And some districts have particular programs that you enter. In Richmond County, it's called Rising Stars. You enter this leadership program. Sometimes you then take a job as either an assistant principal or an instructional coach or some other kind of supervisory job. And then you can often get hired as a principal. So being a teacher is one pathway, right? It's the pathway, I'm sorry, towards being a principal. So, and it's one way you can affect education in a larger way, and you are all being potentially prepared to do so. This is the end of this set of slides. So thanks you guys for listening, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on the podcast that I am asking you to look at. Take care.